Hi. As helping professionals, we're committed to personal and spiritual wellness and cultivating habits that are going to make us powerful and effective and useful to the people who come to us for help. In order to build practices and habits for wellness, we want to think about the resources that are available to us from spiritual tradition. One tool that's available to us is the classical notion of the rule of life. You may have heard of the rule of Benedict or other rules that guide the lives of monks, nuns, and other religious folks, teaching them about their faith in action by calling attention to the choices they make in the way they live together, the way they care for their bodies, the way they pray, the way they deal with money and other resources and stewardship. Nowadays, the rule of life is available to us as a kind of habit formation tool, but we're not very fond of the word rule. We don't really want people telling us what to do. We want rather to discern for ourselves how is the best way to care for our bodies, the best way to care for our money, the best way to engage our relationships so that our practices are healthy and fulfilling and contribute to flourishing and help us be the helping professionals that are going to make a difference for other people. This rule of life practice is a form of rule crafting, and I want to describe how it works so that you can practice it yourself and through engaging this work discern the opportunities to become healthier as well as the beliefs that might limit your ability to fully marshal your resources in helping other people. And we're going to do this all in the context of small experiments. Small experiments are very small changes that you make in your behavior for the sake of learning, for the sake of testing. Small experiments are ways of testing things that you believe are true, maybe even things that you take for granted that may be standing in the way of your healthy practice. So when we say small experiments, we're not talking about self-help. We're not talking about self-care. We're not talking about smart goals. And we're not talking about heroic action to try to fix things that you think are wrong. We're talking rather about intentionally changing your behavior to learn whether some of the things you're afraid of are actually real in order to test what you believe and actually discover the things that you actually have faith in. Let me show you how this works. We use a tool in the creation of a small experiment called a bento box. And this bento box is a way for us to see that we are comparing something that we do now with something that we could do in the future. We're comparing our aspirations with our current behavior. And we're looking at ourselves on two levels, both the level of what our actions are, our behavior, and the beliefs that hold these behaviors in place. As we get more and more aware of what we're doing now and what we're thinking as we do it, or the beliefs that are underneath our habits, we have more and more power to try different things. Let me give you an example of how this tool works to help design a small experiment that might give you insight into your own behavior and perhaps the beginning of some kind of change. Let's start with the box in the upper right-hand corner where we're examining a behavior that you aspire to. Suppose you were reading the Bible and you hear the admonition of Jesus to give to everyone who asks. And something in you says, yes, that's the way that I wish I were. I wish I were generous like that. I wish I believed in a world where I could actually give to everyone who asks. So we start there. There's an aspiration that speaks to you and a vision of how you might behave that's compelling. So the next question to ask is, well, what would happen if you actually did that? And what you discover is a current belief. Well, I'd be exhausted and broke. If I gave to everyone who asked, I'd run out of stuff. And besides, how will I know what to give them? I may not even have enough to share. So we've just uncovered a current belief, and it's a belief that limits your action. So in that respect, it's a limiting belief. I'd like to be generous, but I believe that I have to hold my stuff closely or I'll run out. Now, the next question to ask yourself is, so what am I doing instead? Well, instead what I'm doing is I'm not giving. I'm not even seeing people in need. In fact, I'm looking away. The remaining question is, what would you have to believe in order to be able to give and share? And that's what the last quadrant of the bento box is about. What's a future belief that would actually empower this more generous engagement? Perhaps you'd have to believe that you actually did have enough to share. You have something to give to people who ask. I worked with a student who was compelled by this teaching to give to everyone who asked. And we went through these stages. And she told me, I can't afford to give. And in fact, what I'm doing right now is I'm not looking. I'm looking away so I don't see the need that might convict me and make me feel guilty. And she came up with this small experiment. I'm going to not worry about money for the moment, but make the challenge smaller. This week, I'm going to give my full attention to everyone who is asking. I'm going to actually look and see if people are asking. And when they're asking, I'm going to hear it. I may not give them anything more than my attention. So when she went away and came back after practicing this for a week, her classmates said, "What happened? Did you give people money?" And she said, "Most people aren't asking for money. Most people just want to be heard. Or if I listen to them, I hear a need that I can actually meet, perhaps a need for validation, or a need for sympathy, or a need for being seen." And the students say, "What are you going to do next?" And she said, "I don't know. Maybe I will share. Maybe I'll open my wallet and give them something." She said, "But one thing I can tell you is now that I know that I have something to give, I'm not afraid to see their need or my own." So a small experiment opened for her a different way of seeing. So you can consider, what kind of small experiment might you run around a limiting belief that you have? Where is the opportunity for you to identify something that compels you, that's on your heart, that you could apply this process to? It might be a spiritual teaching, like the one our student responded to. It might also be a habit that you have right now that you feel like is in the way of your personal and spiritual wellness. It might also be simply some aspiration for a different kind of openness, generosity, presence that you're seeking. The more specific you can be in identifying this starting point, the easier this process is to work, and the more powerful your small experiment will be. Some experiments are going to involve risking things, like risking seeing something that you were avoiding. Some will involve refraining from something, like always looking at your phone, or eating a certain food, or responding to an argument in an habitual way. Either of these approaches can be powerful, and the right design will depend on what you're trying to accomplish. We got the idea for this approach by comparing the wisdom literature, the St. Ignatius and the practice of the examen, which is a self-examination in prayer that is part of a religious order, with modern psychology that is explained in the book Immunity to Change by Robert Kegan and Lisa Leahy, which invites you to consider the limiting beliefs and the competing commitments that make it hard for you to live fully into your vocation. So let's look at some examples of how you could apply this small experiments process to different kinds of aspirations. So for instance, suppose you were compelled by the teaching to pray without ceasing, and you loved the idea of a life that could be so completely enveloped in prayer, and yet you say to yourself, well, hold on, if I were praying all the time, I wouldn't get anything done. I've got to keep my mind focused on my work. And so then you might ask yourself, well, what would it look like if I were praying all the time? And you have this notion that prayer involves withdrawing from life or withdrawing from work. But what if there's an alternative? What if praying without ceasing means that prayer doesn't compete with your other activities, but is actually layered into it? What is the smallest way in which you could bring prayer into actions that you are already doing habitually every day? So one student decided that her experiment with praying without ceasing would be her doorknob prayer. Every time she touched a doorknob, she would say, "God be with me as I pass through this door." And since she passed through a lot of doors during the day, she then had an experience of praying without ceasing, which then changed her notion of what the commandment might mean and what the promise of it might be. So the idea of doing something very small in the direction of this aspiration. Another small experiment that's quite famous is the complaint-free world wristband, where you simply try to go without complaining. And you are definitely going to fail at this. And as often as you find yourself complaining, just switch the band to the other arm and see how many times during the day that happens, and pay attention to that. Just the awareness of how often you're complaining and when you're complaining and why you're complaining can reveal commitments that you have, beliefs that you have about your own power, about what it means to engage problems, about how we are together in society in the face of things we can't change. And refraining from the complaint causes you to look for new ways to respond to that tension, and that opens up new ways of seeing. So these are some examples in which spiritual life becomes richer when we interrupt habits, question assumptions, and try things that we thought were impossible, but by doing them in very small ways. We can also look at experiments around money and financial life. One of my favorites is simply to track what I'm spending, to get awareness of what I'm actually doing now. That upper left-hand corner of the bento box is usually a blur for me because I get through the day writing checks, pulling money out of my pocket, doing things online, and I have no idea how money is flowing in my life. But just for 2 weeks to track what you're spending, you don't have to change your behavior any more than paying attention and writing it down. And that, for many of us, has been very insightful and given us a sense of being less at the mercy of some impersonal force. Another student was excited by the small experiment of making sure that they touched the hands of people with whom they were exchanging money, and to remind them that money is not purely impersonal, but rather a tool that flows in a real relationship, even if it's simply with a person you'll only see for a moment at a checkout counter, and looking for a way to create a kind of handshake and an awareness and a respect of the humanity of the person that commerce had brought you in touch with. There are also experiments that we can run with the energy of our bodies. We had a student who was not getting enough sleep and staying up late on his computer, and as he asked himself what would happen if I went to bed earlier, he surfaced this powerful belief that sleep is a waste of time, that I'm valuable because I'm productive. And one of his colleagues offered him an alternative belief, which came from Psalm 127, where it says, "The Lord gives sleep to those he loves." And the student says, well, I don't believe that. I can't actually take that as an occasion to sleep more. The small experiment that he wound up with, though, was simply to test whether sleep was a gift from God, by every night, when he finally decided to lie down and go to sleep, saying, "Thank you, Lord, for the gift of sleep." And he said over time, he looked forward to that moment every night. Even if he didn't go to bed earlier, he looked forward to the possibility of believing for a moment that sleep was not something that was wasteful or a punishment, but rather a gift. Another example of the experiments with the body involved a student who said he was frustrated, he'd gained weight, he was having to take medicine for blood pressure now, his wife was very anxious, and he traced all of this weight gain to the habit of eating potato chips while he sat at his desk studying. And we asked him, why are you eating so many potato chips? And after a while, he said, I eat potato chips because it helps me not to be anxious. And we asked, what are you anxious about? And he didn't have a good answer. He said, in fact, the potato chips help me not think about that. And we asked, what is the belief that you have that's underneath this story? And his answer was, I believe there are things that are too scary to think about. I believe there are things that are frightening, and God is not bigger than these fears. So why not test it? So the small experiment that he decided to run was to keep a pad of Post-it notes beside his desk, and all we asked him to do was, before you eat the potato chip, write down the last thing you were thinking about. And before long, he started to identify some patterns in thought that gave him a way to have conversations with people that he was avoiding. It's a powerful, small thing that can lead to something larger. Finally, we can look at experiments around relationships. One of the most famous small experiments is the 36 questions that lead to love, which after it appeared in the New York Times, I'm sure was being carried around by a lot of people that were doing speed dating. Here the idea is there are some questions that if you talk about with another person, you create a bond of affect between you immediately. And it's an easy thing to test. Asking someone, in what way would you like to be famous? Or before making a telephone call, do you actually rehearse what you're going to say? Questions like this that are proven effective in creating a deeper connection. So there's a small experiment you might try in offering people a chance to share things that you're not typically inviting them to share. I found for me that there was a kind of reflexive judgment that I was feeling towards people I saw in the grocery store. I just would look at them and size them up, and something in my gut was saying, is this someone I should be scared of, or what do I think of this person? And sometimes it was pure prejudice. And as I started to pay attention to it, was very disturbed, because it's completely counter to the belief that I have that everyone is a child of God. And so I tried a small experiment where when I would see people in the grocery store, the prayer that I would offer is, Christ in you. And in time, that small experiment started to become a different experience for me than the encounter of judgment that was happening unconsciously at first, then consciously and fearfully, and then became an occasion for practice and prayer. I did a small experiment conversation with a student who felt like he talked too much in classes. So we worked through to the limiting belief that he was valuable because he was showing what he knew, when in fact the thing he wanted to experiment with is, can I be valuable by helping other people express what they want to share? So his small experiment was, I'm going to ask 3 questions in every class and wait for someone to answer. And that practice led him to a different relationship with the students. These small experiments are an opportunity for you to unsettle habits, to surface limiting beliefs that may be unconscious now, and to not try to fix anything. Small experiments are powerful in creating awareness, and small experiments are an act of courage because they're testing things we've taken for granted. And when we do this work in community, when we share with each other the things we're working on, when we let other people contribute to our design of small experiments, give us ideas, challenge us, when we're accountable to share with people what we've learned from these experiments, the practice is very, very rich. So we want to encourage you to give this a try. Use the Bento Box tool. Pick something that is an aspiration or a challenge for you and find the smallest possible way to test whatever beliefs are holding current habits in place. We are confident that you, like a lot of us here at the seminary, will find this practice rich and contribute to the personal and spiritual wellness that will make you a durable, helpful healer.